Today, I am with someone I've been looking forward to speaking with for a while, Derreck Bennett. Derreck, welcome to the interview.
Thanks for having me.
And I thought I'd give a brief intro bio for you, and then if you could, after I'm done, maybe just add a little bit or clarify if I get anything wrong, but add anything that you want to that kind of tells people who you are, for anyone who doesn't know. You are an author, the author of a book called Addictus, and we'll get into that a little bit. You're also right now working on a chapter for a book called Varieties of Jesus Mythicism. Is that correct?
Yes, in fact, I've actually submitted that chapter a few months ago, and they're working toward publishing the book. So
That's
excited
awesome.
about that. Yeah.
And as far as I understood, that was a combination, our joint effort with David Fitzgerald, Earl Doherty, Neil Godfrey, Stephen Huller, Bill Darlison, Joseph Atwell, Derek, yourself, up to me, Robert Price, Tim Widowfield, and a few others. A lot of those names I do recognize, and I've been excited to read some of their works and see their videos. And in addition to all of that writing that you do, you're also involved in a group called Heresium. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Heresium?
That's exactly right. Heresium.
So that is a Facebook page that explores comparative religion, Christ mythicism, and other topics related to atheism, philosophy, science, secularism, and biblical criticism. And to use the words that Tim Clayson wrote when you all launched that, at the end of his introduction, he said that this was about the truth having the apostles on the run, which I thought was a great way to put it. And looks like you are from Indiana, and you pronounce your name Batman. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes. If you check on Facebook for the pronunciation, it's Batman.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, everyone wants to be Batman, but for me, it's a deep-seated some there's something psychologically off. I want to be Batman so bad. Not to tell you that I have the money or that I'm putting forth the effort. I'm not. I just really, really deep down wish I were Batman. That's all. That's it.
That's awesome. I would at least love to have his car for sure. Addictus. Addictus, I'm going to read here the description of that. It was a non-believer's path to recovery. It tells the story of a recovering alcoholic's spiritual and intellectual journey. It discusses in vivid details your trials with alcoholism and how you eventually found sobriety without reliance on AA or any belief in God. And at that point, my list of the bio is over, but I'd love to hear, tell me what else you're all about. What are you involved in?
Oh, goodness. So, well, I come from something of an unorthodox Christian background. My family, or at least those on my mother's side, were Christian Universalists, not to be confused with Unitarian Universalism, but Christian Universalism, which is the belief that in the end Christ will have prevailed by having saved every last soul, that no one will be condemned to hell for all of eternity. And they went a little further with that, which was the belief in what they called physical salvation. The idea was that if you believed in Christ fully, by embracing this notion that he would save every last living soul, then you shall not perish but have everlasting life. As John chapter 3, verse 16 says, they took that quite literally, and so believed that that we would never die. And of course, that began to crumble early in adolescence when I saw my father pass away, and of course my mom passed away in a car accident some years later. And you could say that was something of a catalyst for me in realizing that not everything I had been told was necessarily true, and kind of opened the door for me to question things and investigate. And so yeah, that, and I tend to think that because oftentimes Christians will stereotype atheists as people who have experienced personal tragedies and are therefore angry with God, and that's why they left the faith. And that's not entirely accurate. I think that with or without those tragedies, I was naturally inquisitive and sort of philosophically minded anyway. So, not to say that that stuff did not play any role whatsoever, but I think I would have questioned things whether or not that stuff had happened, at all. And those types of things having happened was simply, like I said, a catalyst that just kind of sparked my questioning and my investigation and things early on. So it's not as though I harbor any kind of anger at God. As Robert M. Price says in the Reason Driven Life, any kind of anger or resentment toward God is misplaced. It's even that is still harboring a kind of superstition. There's
Yeah.
nothing at which to be angry. You just come to realize that that life happens, and we can only ever have any kind of peace of mind or balance in our lives by realizing that that no one's responsible for this stuff. It's all in how we choose to react to it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's an interesting point. I haven't thought about it quite that way with the quote you just gave, but someone mentioned something a long time ago about the idea of you're getting over your superstitious background when something kind of scary happens and there's not a hint of any dynamic in your mind that says, oh God, please help me. Like you don't pray. If you're near a really dangerous situation and you're thinking, I hope this works out okay, there's nothing in you that defaults to that like it used to. And it's been interesting to see that's it eroded in my mind pretty quickly when I deconverted, but there's still there's just habits that you have. I mean, we have habits for 40 years. It's sometimes you kind of subconsciously fall into them, and it is interesting that like there's nothing there to be angry at, and in the same way there's nothing there to say, please help me, this might not work out so well, and like there's nobody behind the scenes pulling the strings. And
Right.
It is pretty cool when you realize you're getting way past that. Like that's not even an afterthought.
And you sometimes may, occasionally in my writing, not nearly as much as I used to, but you may actually pick up on some kind of anger or righteous indignation in my writing, or perhaps if I'm in a heated discussion or debate with someone. But one has to understand that's not any kind of anger toward, an unseen God. That's an anger toward, either that person or religion itself, or at least a certain stripe or a certain brand of fundamentalist or politically motivated Christianity. But that's quite a different thing from God. I don't believe that God exists, but there's no question religion exists, and so does religious zealotry. And one can be angry with the kinds of negative consequences of those naturally existing institutions, and that has nothing to do with anger toward a divinity. So you often see them making that mistake. Is I can see you're angry and you're angry at God. It's not God, it's religion. God may not be real, but religion certainly is.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to get right back into some of that, some of your story there. I'm going to do a couple quick, easy, lighter questions. We'll take a very quick break from the depths of it all and come right back into it in a minute. Icebreaker. What is your favorite place or kind of place to spend your vacations?
I would say Gatlinburg, Tennessee has got to be one of my favorites. It was a childhood destination, something that my family, we enjoyed going to when I was a kid. I hadn't been there in years, actually, until just a few months ago, back in June. My girlfriend Candace and we went to visit, and it was incredibly nostalgic, and it was everything I remembered it as being and more. I just like how you are sort of, I don't know, you're kind of nestled within this beautiful mountainous area, and there's all these great things to see and do. Uh, Amazing restaurants and attractions. It's a beautiful, exciting place to be.
And now you're in Indiana right now, though, right?
I'm from Evansville, Indiana. I now reside in Paducah, Kentucky.
Okay, gotcha. So you're not too far. I'm down just above Atlanta, Georgia, so
Oh, okay.
few hours away.
Yeah.
Is that, pardon my ignorance, but is that Gatlinburg area? Is that like near Dollywood? I've never
Yes.
been there, but I've heard of it. Okay,
Yes. Yeah.
gotcha.
Yeah.
And next, kind of low-level question. Apart from all the things you're already involved in, assuming that you wrap them up and you have a clear slate, if everything aligned, what would you call your dream project at this point, besides what you're already involved in?
At this point, my dream project would be completing a new book in which I cover a broad range of issues, well, relatively broad, specifically stuff related to biblical criticism, comparative religion, at least as it relates to Judeo-Christianity, various arguments for and against the existence of God, that kind of stuff. You see me post a lot of this stuff on Facebook, actually, on social media. I'm openly sharing a lot of this stuff, but that is actually going to that's going to be reduced here soon, to where I may start a Patreon or something of that nature. Was just looking at that earlier, at the potential for doing that kind of thing. And once I have assembled all of these writings, collected them all, organizing them in such a way, and publishing it in a book.
So some of the stuff you're already sharing, like on Facebook, you would
Yes.
use part of
Yeah.
it. Okay. And just for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's usually, if I'm accurate here, it's about 5 to 10 paragraphs of just a lot of great background information about where the stories in the Bible come from.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Do you enjoy more that stuff and the mythicist stuff, or do you enjoy the philosophical arguments, cosmological argument, etc.? Or are you 50-50 on that?
I would say I primarily focus on the stuff related to comparative religion and
Okay.
Christian origins, but I mess around. I a little bit with with the philosophical arguments, especially where they're related to science or cosmology, just because that kind of stuff has always fascinated me. And I don't like seeing Christian apologists like William Lane Craig try and hijack this stuff and use it to weasel in his Christian theology. That just bothers me. So I try to set the record straight on these arguments for the Big Bang as indicating God having created the universe, or the universe having been fine-tuned. I try to deconstruct some of that stuff, but mostly it's comparative religion and Christian origins and that kind of thing.
And on that note, regarding all those topics that you study, who do you take your inspiration from, or who are your heroes? Like, who is some of the people that really just, if you had to pick a few YouTube videos to listen to over and over, like who do you go to?
Robert M. Price is undoubtedly number one for me when it comes to Christian origins and biblical criticism. If you really want to get into some good stuff regarding cosmology and the implications for theology and whatnot, Sean Carroll, he's one of the best. He actually debated William Lane Craig and cracked the whip on him pretty well. It was Dr. Craig is such a great rhetorician that he tends to dominate in his debates, even though he's he's completely full of crap on a lot of this stuff. But he's such a great speaker and debater that he tends to be the victor, I'd say. But not in this debate. In this one, Sean Carroll had him against the ropes. It was was quite a spectacle.
That's awesome. I don't think I've seen that one. I'll have to make sure I look that one up. So going back to some of the deeper stuff, could you tell me a little bit more of the details of your deconversion? I know you kind of left off at the issue of the deaths in your family, and that issue kind of immediately a question, but how did you go from there to, your current position?
Yeah, so with the death of my father, clearly the Christian Universalist slashed physical salvation thing that fell apart. No, we were not going to live forever as a result of believing in Christian Universalism.
Hmm.
So I think for some years after, I sort of I kind of was sort of an agnostic, atheist, whatever you want to call it. I probably had more questions than answers. And I guess it was during my college years at Ball State, there was a professor who had mentioned something along the lines of one of these mythic parallels to Christ, but it was it was brief and in passing. It was just enough for me to kind of say, wow, I wonder what that's all about. And then some years later, a close friend of mine, we'd always kind of been on the same page about this stuff. We're more or less agnostic, but he fully converted to Christianity. And so that I guess it kind of caught me off guard. I was like, well, I didn't see that coming, but hey, maybe there's something more to this. Maybe I need to look into this a little more deeply and see if he's onto something. But it really didn't take long before I came across the works of Acharya S., her Truth Be Known website, a lot of these parallels that you find in Zeitgeist and in Bill Maher's Religionists and whatnot. I took a real interest with that, and as well as Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which came out in 2003. I was hooked. I was fascinated with this stuff, and wanted to know more. So of course I did a lot of research on my own on these topics, and in the process I discovered Christian apologetics, the work of James Patrick Holding on the Tectonics Ministries website, and he debunked a lot of this stuff pretty handedly. And so I found I had to wade through a lot of crap to try and determine what was true from what was false. As there's as much misinformation out there as there is information, and a lot of the stuff, in my opinion, when it comes to Zeitgeist and whatnot, doesn't really hold up. It's not really substantiated by the historical record as far as I see it. But what I came to realize was that even the Acharya S's and Dan Browns of the world were at least in the ballpark, generally speaking. When I came across the works of Robert M. Price and Richard Carrier and others, and then from there, looking at the scholars that they themselves cited, I began to realize that a lot of this stuff is legit. Christianity is absolutely a product of its time and place. I mean, you look at other myths regarding, the Egyptian Osiris, Greco-Roman figures or saviors like Romulus, Heracles, Asclepius, and so forth. A lot of these parallels are legit, and even if they are not identical, they are at least similar. Close enough to be able to say this is all just kind of cut from the same cloth, even if they're not directly or intentionally borrowing this stuff in the New Testament. You can tell it's all part of the same mythic consciousness. Like I said, it's cut from the same cloth, the same kind of myth-making tendencies in antiquity. So I would say that generally speaking, I was agnostic for some years until I really began to dive into this stuff. and as well as sort of the philosophical arguments for and against God, and eventually, by my early 30s, I had embraced atheism,
Hmm.
and even that's not to say that I know for a fact that there is no God in any way, shape, or form. I just I don't see the evidence as being compelling for any such thing. And there's a caveat there too, in that I'd say I do feel fairly certain that the biblical God does not exist. We can actually trace his mythic and literary origins. But as to the larger question of whether or not there is some type of God, I am both agnostic and atheist. Agnosticism addresses knowledge and atheism addresses belief. So I don't claim to know for a fact. I just don't find the evidence compelling and therefore disbelieve.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that for sure. And I'm always fascinated by people's responses once they're at that point, and including my own, where you could get to a point mentally where you say this false worldview has had enough of a hold on me for enough of my years that I'm beyond done with it in terms of believing it, but I kind of just want to walk away. Like it's had its tentacles in me too long. And yet I see a lot of us, and I say a lot of us, I'm not obviously talking to everybody's experience here, but a lot of the people, at least in the circles that we would probably go in, you see uh, people kind of turning right back into it and saying, now that I'm out, I don't care one snitch about it, but I want to know, how did it happen? How did it evolve? And it sounds like it's like you went right back into it just to figure out what was this all about in the first place, even though now it's not true. Is that fair to
Absolutely.
say?
You want to understand it, and to me it's just inherently fascinating. I don't feel as though I'm in the trenches trying to do battle with this thing at all. I just want to understand it. And of course, in the process of trying to understand it and share your knowledge with others, you're going to come up against some people who don't like what you're doing. So you do inadvertently find yourself battling it out with those people in the I guess the world of clashing ideas, so to speak. But I'm not trying to rid the world of religion or Christianity. I wouldn't classify myself an anti-theist by any means. I am just trying to better understand it, and like I said, share that knowledge with others. To me, it's none of my business whether someone agrees with me or whether someone is, a person of faith. Um, Whether or not I have an affinity or liking to what a person has just about zip to do with where they stand on these issues. I pretty much love everyone equally. Um, but I don't know where I'm going with this. I just, I'm coming at this, I guess, from more of an academic and philosophical standpoint. Um,
Well, do you
and
feel like the world would be better off if some of this stuff died out, especially when you have people at the highest levels of authority in our world who at least profess, who knows if it's real, and in some cases it doesn't seem very real, but they profess that this is their worldview.
mhm.
They've got their finger on the trigger of our economy, of our weapons, of so much in our social lives. And is there any part of you that feels like, and this is kind of getting into more my uh, my feelings about the matter, but I'm just curious how you would take it, how you'd see it. I'm more of the side of where I certainly respect people's freedom to believe what they want, but I do believe that the world would be a better place if mythology and superstition died off, at least in terms of the people that get to make all the decisions for us. Um, I know that's partially related to questions of separation of church and state and blah, 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 but do you feel like there's any value in trying to make inroads, or is it more purely academic for you at this point?
um, it is more academic than anything else. But when it comes to I guess when it comes to the kind of implications or ramifications for, having religion in the world, for having Christianity so abundantly in our country, I try to see it in light of, what are that person's motivations? For instance, I have a lot of religious friends and family who I care about tremendously. I see that their faith makes them happy. I have no inclination whatsoever to want to take that away from them.
Yeah.
None. I wouldn't have them any other way, really. That's not to say if they didn't come to shed their faith for whatever reason, I wouldn't still love them just the same. But
Right.
that's not the end goal for me at all. It just isn't. I'm mostly trying to share this stuff with people who are like-minded. If I rock the boat a little bit and get people to think, then wonderful. But I'm not really out there to try and knock down anyone's faith. I make a distinction, though, between religious people who I really think are harmless, and those who want to impose their religious worldview on the rest of us. Those who, pretty much those who belong to the religious right.
Right.
The ones who are politically motivated, the supporters for Donald Trump, and so forth. I have a real problem with the religious right. I have a real problem with these people, and I'm on the same page with you when it concerns that particular stripe of Christianity. But at the same time, I can't help but acknowledge that there are a lot of good Christian people out there who do not side with these clowns. They do not. They are good, compassionate, big-hearted people who they see through the veil. They see through the bullshit, if I may say so. That is the conservative or Republican Party, the alt-right and whatnot, who are using this. They're utilizing religion as a tool in order to solidify their base, acquire votes, and further their own agenda, even get people to vote against their own best interests. People who are in middle and lower income who are casting their Republican votes, and they don't get it. They're being snowed. So I have a problem with that, but I'm very careful to make a distinction between religious people whom I regard as harmful, as harmless, good people, and those who are harmful.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes
Would
sense.
you include apologists in that to some extent?
I would to some extent, in that, the agenda of Christian apologists is to simply comfort those within Christendom. If people are having creeping doubts or whatnot, they're trying to say, hey, no, don't worry about this stuff. We do have a good intellectual, rational defense, and that's fine, except for where they are, those of us who take an academic interest in this stuff and write and share our views. Well, we're going to bump heads quite naturally with the apologists. So, when they're putting out misinformation out there, fallacious arguments, things that just do not are not factual, for that matter, that's where I have a problem. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, going back briefly, I want to get into a few deeper topics, but just going back to your wrap up the beginning of your story. Did you grow up in an environment where the gospel, if this wasn't a big part of your upbringing, I'm sure you've been exposed to it since, but where it's gospel, gospel, gospel. You could be in different denominations, some maybe they would consider better than others, but just this core idea of you have to be the kind of person that understands, your depravity, your wretchedness before Christ, your emptiness of any righteousness. Christ is the only one who provides it, and he is your substitute. He's not, someday you're perfect in heaven, in glory, but right now you are, as if in a court, you are legally declared justified. You're declared righteous, and it's all of grace. It's all of him. It's all the glory to him. All the soul is. It's all about what he did, not about what we brought to the table. Was that part of that church's dynamic, or was it different?
Well, interestingly enough, we didn't go to church. I
Okay.
did not attend church as a child, and I've never regularly attended church because of my family's very unorthodox views that Christ would not consign anyone to hell eternally, but that he would eventually save every last living soul. Well, that's not really mainstream Christianity.
Right.
So we didn't attend church. So I didn't have what I would call any kind of hardcore Christian upbringing, though my mother was very devout. And so she pretty well saw everything through the lens of her Christian faith. And it was something that was very much instilled in me, but not quite to the degree that you're talking about. Now, where I have felt that is, interestingly enough, not so much my childhood upbringing, but in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's where, though AA is not specifically a Christian faith, it is nonetheless, it's grounded in Christian faith. It's whole theology, so to speak. It comes straight from Christianity. AA tries to deny that it's a religion. It says we are a spiritual, not a religious program. This is an absolute distinction or distinction without a difference fallacy, because AA has all the characteristics of a religion, even if it's not directly affiliated with any particular region. It doesn't need to be. It is its own religion, and it's one that is absolutely inspired by the Christian faith, and it carries over that dogma, that anti-humanistic theology that you are inherently flawed. You are consumed with shortcomings and character defects and all this. And they
Isn't that even one of the first tenets or something? One of the
Oh yeah, it's enshrined in the 12 steps. Nothing in there at all whatsoever about learning to embrace or acknowledge your assets or strengths. You're not taught to love yourself. They don't come right out and say this, but you're almost taught to have this sort of groveling negative view of yourself. And it's very much related to Pauline Christianity's views of one being mired in sin and the weakness of the flesh. That's where
right?
Stuff is coming from. And so it's within and mind you, again, I try to be sophisticated about this. I don't disparage anyone who participates in Alcoholics Anonymous. I have many friends that do, and it works for them, and I encourage them to participate if it's helping them. But my experience with it has been not good. It's because it's not just that I deny or disbelieve in the existence of God. It is in particular that very anti-humanist, counterproductive theology that is built into it that I have a real problem with.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Could I ask just about that part of your life? And I don't want to dwell too much on it, but how long ago did you kind of get over that? And just for my curiosity, do you feel like there's ever times when that becomes either that or any kind of substitute becomes a draw to go back to something like that, just to say, hey, this is, I don't know if something else, bad happens in life, is there that temptation to use anything, or was it like once you were done, it was like I mean, I'm curious because I remember years ago, I used to ride the train in Philadelphia, where I'm from, and there was this guy I just befriended, and we ended up talking almost every day. And he would tell me straight up, he's like, if I don't go like every day, I know I'm in trouble. And I'm just curious, what's your experience been once you went through what you did?
Yeah, well, I don't attend AA meetings.
Okay.
One of the things that AA teaches is to avoid resentment. So
Hmm.
one of the best ways for me to avoid resentment is not to go to AA. So um, I my I guess my history with addiction and substance abuse and my story therein is somewhat complicated. You know, if you are an alcoholic or an addict, you have a lifelong condition. You're never
Yeah.
cured, ever, ever. So um, I have had periods of long-term or extended sobriety and have fallen on my face all over again. I was somewhere between 2 and 3 years sober when I wrote Addictus, and sadly, I wound up relapsing, you know, after having written that book, which I admitted in the book could happen. I never declared total victory or triumph. I came right out and said, hey, you know, this could happen again. This is a lifelong condition. So I was honest about that.
Hmm.
And sure enough, I did. And, you know, every time you fall harder
Yeah.
every single time. It's, you know, you think you found the bottom and it turns out there's a trap door and you find an all new bottom.
Hmm.
And, you know, of course I've since gotten back on the horse. I'm at 2 years of sobriety once again, which shows you that you can do this. You can maintain long-term sobriety without belief in God or attendance to AA or fully embracing every single one of its tenets. Though I think there's some stuff in AA that is valuable, but you don't have to be a fanatic and you don't have to be wedded to Alcoholics Anonymous in order to achieve long-term sobriety. Plenty of people could throw it in my face that I have relapsed, you know, and even since having written the book. But I've got news for you: that happens
Yeah.
with all Alcoholics Anonymous and addicts, precisely because it is a lifelong condition, and whether you attend AA or not, this happens to people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think I can just.
Yeah, well, I hope that book is helped to some people. I'll definitely put a link in the bottom of the video so people can look it up and get it. And I've often thought too, was just a quick side note, I'll move on to the next topic, but it's kind of weird how we all tend to look at some of the more obvious um, addictions that, you know, we can point to and say, there's a bottle or there's a pill. It's like we're all addicted to something. Some people are addicted to, you know, love or, you know, any number of emotional issues where it's like or we're just so power hungry or whatever it is. And some of us, there'll never be a word that'll come to our mind and say, you're a this. And it's like, that's your addiction. It's official. But it's like, we're all struggling. And in some ways, it's almost, I've wondered if it's at times easier if you've got a title for it, because you're like, okay, it's crystal clear, I can attack it. Versus if you can kind of get under the radar and everyone just thinks, oh, that's just a quirk of his personality or her tendency or her family, you know, she's this ethnic background and they always tend to be this way. So that's just like explains it. You know, you'd hear someone say, I remember I used to be a carpenter, my boss was Italian. He'd say, oh, we just love to yell at each other, you know, and it was like an excuse, but maybe there's something more there. You know, maybe people have certain tendencies because there is an addiction to power or some other way and of acting. And it's interesting how we tend to ignore some of the stuff that might actually be even more powerful and life altering in a bad sense, even though it's very easy to hide it. And I mean, we all have closets, you know, places that we hide. And I think it's great though that you were willing to be so brave and take it out in the public and say, hey, there is a path here and I've taken it. So kudos to you for taking that journey.
Thank you. Thank you. That's the most important thing I have to give, is to share my experience and let others know that that they can do this, even if they do not buy into, because unfortunately AA just has a monopoly on the field of addiction and recovery. Practically any institution or rehabilitation facility you go to is going to have institutionalized AA. You're going to be introduced to it there and encouraged to carry on with it, when you leave. And again, I have to emphasize, if AA works for you, please, by all means, have at it. I encourage it. I support it. It just hasn't worked for me. And I know that that's the case for many others. So it's important for me to reach out to those people and say, hey, you're not alone. You're not alone.
Yeah.
And yes, you can, forget this message of powerlessness and instead embrace self-empowerment. That's the antithesis to everything Alcoholics Anonymous. But I believe in self-empowerment rather than being taught that you are weak and powerless, and that you can overcome this on your own merits. And that's not to say that I've done it completely on my own. I have undoubtedly had a tremendous amount of help from others, and I am absolutely grateful for that. I cannot let them go unacknowledged. But the great thing about people is that they are real. They undoubtedly exist.
Yeah.
Why would I pray to something that I'm fairly certain is not there when I could reach out to someone who I know is there?
Yeah.
And confide in them and talk to them about my struggles. And of course, AA has that aspect naturally. It has that community aspect, but unfortunately, because of the religious dogma, it's just, it always leaves me with a bad taste in my mouth. So I think it's important that we have a network of support, whether that is inside or outside the halls of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that in addition to embracing that support, that you realize that you do within you, you do have the power to beat this, even if you are never cured, even if you could, like me, fall on your face all over again. It doesn't mean that you're not doing a wonderful job, and it doesn't mean just because you have relapsed in the past that you're bound to do so in the future. Just because it could happen again, absolutely could happen again, doesn't mean that it has to.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting segue talking about it as an addiction to kind of start to move into some of the other topics, because there is a sense in which religion is an addiction. And just as you said, I wasn't thinking to put this as part of the our chat today, but it's this topic's come to my mind a lot, is that there are people, I would imagine, I've never experienced them, but I would just imagine that this is so, that with the correct information, meaning the information you present, in your Heresium and your books, and the information we get from Dr. Bob, Dr. Carrier, David Fitzgerald, all those great people, that for the right person, or should I say the wrong person, that would literally cause them tremendous despair, because they would realize very quickly, shoot, this isn't real. And I've heard that, in writing, that for some people, their default response is, why would I want to live then? If there's no God, if there's no Jesus, there's no heaven, why live? And so I know, you ever heard of Pine Creek Doug, his channel?
Pine Creek, yeah.
He's addressed it at least once or twice, where he talks about how, like if he senses that by addressing a certain topic with someone, it's going to lead them to be suicidal or to despair, he'll just drop it. And it's almost like you're saying, if you need AA, do it. If you need to be in church, do it. And it's you want to bring people past the crutches, but you also want to give them the freedom to take the time. It took me 43 years to escape. I obviously needed a crutch for a while. I was addicted to religion. If someone else needs a crutch, we all have our own speeds as to how we can process this stuff.
I would rather you be happy and well than agree with me.
Right.
Hands down, no doubt about it. It's, if you and I are on the same page regarding religion or politics, that certainly opens the door for a deeper connection, and it's nice having that with my significant other and with various friends and so forth. But, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And, I wish someone well more than anything else. And so, yeah, if it's providing you comfort and happiness and you're not hurting anybody, then by all means, have at it. I'm all for it.
I have a lot more I want to say on that topic, even on what you just said, but I also want to give us time to go through further. So I'll save some of my rabbit trails for the next video, maybe down the line, if we can do some more later. But I did want to get into a few specific topics that I know are on your heart, and I wanted to ask first. I know this is not something I've heard you bring up too much, but I think you may have enough background to address it. For someone that's never heard of the term astrotheology, in your words, what is that about? And is that relevant? Is it a topic that's worthy of study? In terms of if you really were trying to figure out where did this religion come from?
I would say yes, but not to the degree that some take it. I think what Acharya S. does and her fellow zeitgeist enthusiasts, whom I'm sure will be on the attack for me having said this, but they build a theory, and I like this theory. This makes sense. It's simple and it's attractive for that reason. And so I've got this this broad grand theory. Now I've got to take all the data and make it fit,
right?
Kind of hell or high water. And the problem is that not all of the data is completely amenable to that theory. Mm-hmm. I think with regard to some of the parallels that Acharya S., the stuff she's brought to light and tried to defend, she may find like really obscure material or data from the far corners of the earth. And so hey, that's valid, but how widely was that believed? And can you necessarily take a piece from here and a piece from there and then a piece from over here and squash them all together and say, aha, you have this figure that was just like Jesus? Well, only if you are piecing together disparate data with regard to one particular figure or more, and cramming them all together when that was not always necessarily the case of any one given figure. That's the problem as I see it. I think David M. Litwa spoke very well on that issue in How the Gospels Became History. But I want to, I'm a huge comparative religion enthusiast, and I love discussing the parallels between Christ and other mythic figures and whatnot. I'm a big fan of this stuff, but I will not countenance anything that is not substantiated by the historical record or by credible or reputable scholars in the field. And if you're using a dubious methodology to make these comparisons, I can't get behind it.
Right. Let me ask it this way. Do you think that, not that everyone who ever believed the Bible or was in biblical times, that they all understood it necessarily? Because there is a sense of the mystery, the hiddenness, the elite or the initiated get it, that the common people, it's just a story. But for at least some of the initiated, for some of the elite, some of the writers of this stuff, especially weaving in that they're probably doing a lot of this either through or at Alexandria, Egypt, at the library, with exposure to all these different ideologies. Is it possible, and do you know of any passages where you would say, this is a story, and whether there's some good vibes you get from reading it as a straight story, the reality is this is too eerily similar to what happens with the equinoxes and the with the stars and the sun, this is clearly representative of the stars and the sun, or things like that, where it's like if you ignore that parallel, we're probably missing the point of this story. Whether or not we understand everything that the initial people who wrote it would have meant by it and who they were trying to share it with in their little secret societies, but that at the end of the day, like for example, I'm thinking just off the top of my mind, Elisha and the bears, and the children, or Samson with his hair. Do you feel like that is legitimate, or do you take some of those stories and do you deconstruct them in a different way and say it's possible, but that's a stretch? It's probably not what's actually happening. How do you take that?
I think that with some of it is possible. For instance, Dr. Price has spoken on the Elijah-Elisha dichotomy between, symbols of the sun and of the moon, and I think that there's probably something to be said for that. With the ancient Egyptians, of course, they greatly revered the sun, and whether it was Akhenaten's heretical monotheistic reform where he made the sun the one god, the Aten, or it was the more traditional ancient Egyptian religion, they still had this great worship and reverence for the sun. And it's interesting, you do see there in their resurrection and ascension theology this idea where you are raised to the sky and you shine again like the bright and radiant and glorious sun, and you see that same kind of concept in depictions of Christ's return in power and in glory, and even in the Transfiguration on the Mount. So some of that stuff I do think is legitimate. I see. I think when it comes to anything that is a vestige of natural phenomena, I see a lot more significance in terms of the mystery religions and how they related to the solar cycles as well as the cycles of death and rebirth, as we see, as seen in crops or vegetable life. I think that's much more on point. Without a doubt, some of these deities like Baal and Adonis and Osiris, the mysteries of Eleusis regarding Demeter and Kor and whatnot, there's definitely the vestiges of agricultural reverence and worship. And just as you had the death of the planted seed and its rebirth into new life, there's definitely a strong parallel there. And in fact, I think it just undoubtedly influenced New Testament theology. And in the writings of Paul, you see the sort of mystery cult soteriology where one dies and rises with Christ. The death of the planted seed and the whole notion of rebirth and resurrection, it's all kind of interrelated. That kind of stuff, I think, is much more substantiated by the data and by credible scholars, and without a doubt, I think it holds the most water.
Okay, good. I appreciate that answer.
Yeah.
What is your take on the whole? Maybe I should step back because I know you've gone very deep with a lot of other interviews, and this one is probably more of a surfacey interview because I'm assuming some people that watch this have never heard of what we're talking about. So maybe could I even ask, just what would you say is a couple minutes worth of a description of a mystery cult or mystery school? Like what's going on in that, and when are we talking about in history?
Okay, so of course, we had as a philosopher Prodicus of Chios, or I don't know how it's pronounced, but he himself theorized that the gods and goddesses were basically personifications of natural phenomena. And that can go for the rising sun as well as rivers and creeks and trees and the death and rebirth of the crops and whatnot. But of course, man had um, man had to put a lot of stock in the seasons and in seasonal change and how that related to sustenance. How were you going to live? You had to be able to grow food and eat. So that was of just absolute paramount importance. And so quite naturally, we personified the cycles of the crops and so forth, even the solar cycles themselves, and we saw the rhythms of death and rebirth. We couldn't help personify this and deify it, and so naturally you had various divinities who themselves underwent some kind of process of death and rebirth, or trial and triumph, or even death and resurrection, in some sense. And as time went on, just as you have various rituals and rites of initiation and whatnot, man came to believe that you could, via certain ritual activities, that you could participate mystically or ritually in the death and rebirth, or death and resurrection, of that divinity, so that you too could have this promise of some kind of life in the hereafter. And that you too could be immortalized and thereby become a god. The whole idea of Christ being a situation where God became man so that man could become God. That's kind of the whole idea. And so, if you joined in that process, having died, metaphorically, symbolically, ritually, as the God had done, and then being reborn in the image of that deity, with the culmination of which would be, eternal life in the hereafter, or however it took place. That was central to the mystery religions, and you see that very much in Christianity. And what's interesting is you see this idea. I mean, the mystery religions were prominent during the Hellenistic period. That was the period in the Greco-Roman world following the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, where you had all these different cultures, Jewish, Egyptian, Greek. They became mixed and merged in ways that they never had before. And so you had these new religious syntheses and syncretisms, where ideas became fused and merged, and you had these whole new developments. That would never have happened had it not been for the conquests of Alexander. As I tell people, Christianity simply wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Alexander the Great.
You mentioned rituals. That wouldn't have anything to do with, say, baptism or the Lord's Supper, would it?
Yeah, what's interesting is that, baptism originally seems to have been some kind of intra-Jewish rite, where it was more about just purification. But in Paul's letters, particularly in Romans chapter 6, baptism is explicitly that process of having died with Christ and having been raised with him. That's where you see that key mystery religion soteriology. And what's interesting is that, granted, this stuff was prominent during the Hellenistic age. It goes back as far as ancient Egypt, as far as the 3rd millennium BC. That was the kind of salvation scheme that was tied to the death and resurrection of Osiris.
You get baptized and identify with him.
Yeah, it may or may not have. I think it was more in terms of the embalmment process. That it wasn't a ritual that took place while you were alive. It was different in that once you had died, via the embalming process, you too could become an Osiris, and you would be raised, to live a new life in the hereafter. You were nevertheless this wasn't like the kind of body soul dichotomy where one dies and their soul is simply released into heaven, as the apologists try to make it out to be. You were absolutely you were raised, you were revivified in the body. You were reassembled as Osiris had been. You shook off the bandages. You tossed off the dust. You were raised in a new body, but you didn't resume your earthly life. You lived on in the Duat or an Amenti or something of that nature. It's the same thing for Christians, depending on which text in the New Testament that you're reading. Some have the millennial kingdom on earth. In other verses, you go with Christ to heaven, such as in John's gospel, in 1 Thessalonians 4, I believe, where the rapture takes place, even though the word rapture isn't used there.
Right.
It's the same idea. Everyone's raised up to heaven.
Yep.
So this idea exists within Christianity also, regardless of what you'll hear from Christian apologists. And it was kind of a very similar thing in the Egyptian salvation scheme. So as Osiris had been bodily raised and then went on into the next world, so too could you be by being mystically joined to him in death via the ritual of embalmment. So you see this mystery religion. Soteriology refers to salvation schema. So when you hear me say soteriology, that's what that is.
Right.
You see that soteriology going all the way back to the 3rd millennium BC in ancient Egypt. Undoubtedly, the Egyptians had a heavy impact on the Greco-Roman world as well. They looked to Egypt. The way we look to the Greco-Roman world today, that's how they looked to ancient Egypt. They had the same kind of awe and reverence for that ancient culture, and they were very much influenced by them. And I can't help but think, though it can't be proven, that a lot of the mystery religions of antiquity and the Hellenistic period were probably heavily influenced by ancient Egyptian salvation schemes and mysticism.
And in terms of the mystery itself, I know that part of it is this mystery of the union with the God. But was there any other part of the mystery that as you're studying this stuff, that you feel like is part of it? And what I mean by that is this: as you look at all the angelology stuff, which we may or may not get into, the different levels of heaven. I've been studying Pythagoreanism and his whole magic numbers that have power. The idea that if you have visions, or even after you die, you go through the levels of heaven, you may need code words to get through the different levels. There's just so much to study and learn on this stuff. But as you look at this, what do you think, if you were a person that had lived then, and someone said, "Hey, I'm in this group," and they wouldn't have called it, of course, a mystery school, but if you got this sense that that's what's going on, and finally you get through certain initiations, you go through their baptism, you drink their beer and bread or wine and bread, and you go through it all, and you're now at a stage where they say, "We'd like you to join our group," and they'd say, "We have some secrets, some cosmic powerful secrets that you must swear to secrecy on." What do you think those conversations would have gone like? Do you have any guesses or information about that?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's only so much that we can know, and there's other things that we cannot know. But we do know that we get something of a guarded description in Apuleius's Metamorphoses. It's a 2nd century work where he talks about the protagonist Lucius having undergone the ritual in the Greco-Roman mysteries of Isis and Osiris. And he does undergo a sort of ritual or spiritual death and rebirth, after which he wears the crown and garments of the god. Therefore, he's identified with the greatest among the gods, which in this case would have to have been Osiris, as Apuleius tells us some verses later. So we do get, like I said, a guarded description of what's going on there, and it comports so well with the ancient Egyptian mortuary cult. The difference being that whereas in the Egyptian cult you were reborn upon death, here they're bringing that salvation into the here and now, where you can undergo the ritual and be reborn already, but the ultimate culmination of that process would be what you experienced after death or when you were raised or whatever, in Christianity.
Right.
So granted, it's a second century work. We know that the sort of conceptual roots or conceptual precursors of this were Egyptian, undoubtedly. They didn't get this from Christianity because it's all too similar to ancient Egyptian mortuary salvation or cult. And so that right there gives us some indication of at least the similarities or parallels with Christian theology. You get the sense that they would have thought themselves as having been reborn, saved, placed in the spirit of grace. You definitely get that sense, and they undoubtedly knew, they expected to be able to live on in the hereafter, or to have some kind of happy existence in the afterlife, as multiple texts do inform us. So you're able to at least know that much, even if you don't know the precise details of what the experience was. You know that it was undoubtedly one that transposed some kind of salvific grace or rebirth, so to speak.
Right. And what were the visions? What do you think they were about? Paul talks about being taken up to the third heaven. He obviously had a vision of Christ. He never ever talks about anything except his visions. He has all these visions of Christ, and it's not till the Gospels much later that you get this, euhemerization probably of these stories that get added to the visions. I'm really curious, was it only specific people that supposedly have religions, or something that have visions? How did they have visions? I wonder. I've seen people suggest that it was literally through magic mushrooms. Other people have said, no, that's not really what happened. I asked Dr. Carey even about it, and he said, no, that's not what this was about. How prevalent do you think visions were? Was everybody having them, like a charismatic church, maybe when everyone starts speaking in tongues? Do you have any information that you could clarify for me about the visions happening?
It's hard to say what those were exactly. Of course, one of the terms used in the mystery religions and in the New Testament is apoptes, which means to behold. So they certainly beheld something. And a lot of times that the emphasis was on some kind of light, So there's also this parallel with the solar theology, in which you have the sun descend into darkness or death and then rise into the light of life. It could have been a situation where they underwent a catabasis, where they went underground and perhaps in the evening and were brought out during the daylight. But there was certainly some kind of beholding of light. Light definitely had a significance. And light is very much associated with divinity. Even in mythic accounts that are not expressly from the mystery religions, you see that. Romulus, when he appears to Proculus in his post-mortal form, he's beheld in glowing armor. Demeter, Apollo. There's this association with light and divinity, which you also see in the Transfiguration on the Mount with Christ. And as we talked about before, when upon his glorious return, as he comes upon the clouds in power and glory, there are multiple instances of this. Whatever they beheld, we know it was illuminating.
Yeah, but as you were saying that, talking about what they're seeing, I was remembering a passage in Colossians. Paul's Colossians 2, around verse 18, says, "Let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by them delighting in self-abasement and the worship of angels, or taking their stand on visions that they have seen, inflated without cause by their fleshly minds." And you get the sense that Paul is trying to say, people are having visions, but don't let people give their vision and say, this is the way it is because, I'm the one that's got the main vision from God. So my vision is the real one, follow Christ, the Christ I described from my vision, not these other, little, maybe fake visions that people are having. And you get the sense that they're definitely talking about it. There's definitely this sense of people are presenting even perhaps different Christ. Like there's a couple verses that talk about, if I presented Christ other than such and such, let me be anathema. I think it's in Galatians. And you get the sense people are talking about different versions of Christ and, obviously visions of it. And then you bring in the whole forgery and counter forgery, and it's a mess. But it really does seem like they were really big, at least at somewhere around the beginning of it, of saying, I'm seeing stuff, and it's real. I'm not having dreams. This isn't just I had a, really rough meal, and that night it just took me into some dreamlands. Like I actually went somewhere. God or the angels took me, and I saw something very special. And I love guessing, and I know that's all we can do is guess. But when I started looking at Pythagoras as well, and then hearing this stuff about the whole levels of heaven that Dr. Carey's talked about a little bit in the Archons and the Metatron, I'm thinking, if it wasn't magic mushrooms, these guys had some pretty wicked visions, whatever they wanted, visions or dreams. That's some really interesting stuff. I mean, they're having like the kind of stuff that you think is in a Marvel movie these days. Like they're going into all kinds of crazy stuff, and it's amazing to just to think about and speculate on as to what was going on there.
Yeah, the healing god Asclepius, who like Christ, he healed the lame, the paralytic, and those born blind, and he raised the dead. Those are not only does Justin Martyr say as much, but you can actually find there's a great book called Miracles in Greco-Roman Antiquity, where you can actually see these ancient accounts, and Asclepius does precisely those things. But he traditionally appeared to people in dreams, but you have a couple of accounts of not just Celsus, but Maximus of Tyre and one other, I can't remember specifically who it was, where they're saying, no, this was no dream. I saw this guy, not a mere phantom, kind of like Jesus does in Luke chapter 23, see it as I, not some mere ghost, not some phantom that you're seeing here. So there was a lot of emphasis placed on having had these visions, and the more concrete you could make them, the better. As we see, there is this in the New Testament, there's this process by which initially, like in the Pauline corpus, they're just visions. But as we move into the Gospels, it wasn't just a vision. I actually touched and beheld this guy. They had to really sell it to the doubters. So, why was there so much emphasis placed on having had these visions? Who knows? And I tell you, I would not completely discount the possibility that some of this was drug-induced. It may very well have been. I don't know how much direct evidence we have of that, but I think it's a reasonable inference.
Yeah, I know there's at least a small group of mythicists that have brought that forward. I haven't honestly dug too deep into it, but and like I said, Dr. Carey just straight up is like, no, that's not what we're talking about. But it is fascinating to at least study, because it seems it's at least part of history. Some groups were doing it.
I think he ascribes that to like schizotypal personality. Yeah. I say, who knows,
Yeah.
But the one thing's for sure, you can't do like an apologist and say, well, Christ must have really been raised from the dead because these people were seeing the guy. They were having these appearances. Well, that was the same with with deity A, B, and C down the road. If you're going to credit the Christian visions, you've got to credit those too, or else it's just special pleading.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I wanted to ask you about one final major section that I've been fascinated by, and I want to give people we've been talking around a topic or a subject that, just in case anyone out there is not familiar with it, mythicism. It's the idea, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the idea that it's very possible, if not probable, that Jesus never existed, that there wasn't a guy at the beginning. Obviously, no one can say without, having a time machine for sure, but saying in all likelihood, it looks like this was made up. just all things being equal. And in that line of thinking, with that kind of background, I wanted to ask, could you define what mimesis is, and where we're seeing these, and you touched on parallels, but like not just the God parallels, but even the parallels from, say, the Greek epics, or even Greek teachings, or Pythagoras for that matter. Like, where do you see some of the stories, like when you see Jesus walking on water, you see him saying, hey, pull up the fish, and there's 153 of them. You see him feeding 5,000. Some of these stories, we're used to reading them as, as kids and going to church, whatever, Sunday school. You're just used to thinking this was history. And even as an adult, if you're not challenged on it or challenging yourself, you're still thinking this is probably history for the most part, if not literally exactly history. And then when you get exposed to some of the stuff that you've gone through, that I'm starting to get into, I'm jealous, by the way. You're many steps ahead of me, and most of the people that I think I'm going to interview are many steps ahead of me, and I appreciate it.
You got to start somewhere.
You got to start somewhere. You got to do it. But and honestly, the list of subjects is overwhelming, and this is a quick side, but when you're talking about, you got to master the forgeries, the counter forgeries. When I say master, you mean to speak with any level of understanding. The forgeries, the counter forgeries, the canonicity, early church history, the stuff that we would call, that we at least used to call Gnosticism. I know that just, got knocked out, but Josephus, the Greco-Roman era, the gods, the mystery cults, even stuff like Kabbalah, and the way the gematria, numerology. There's endless subjects, but it seems like one of the quickest ways to show someone conclusively, I think, that this is a copy in some sense, is to literally show them some of the stories that came from, and say, all right, I'm going to read this story from such and such a source, and then we're going to go to the scripture, and I want you to tell me, do you see a parallel? And unless you're just being flat out dishonest, you're going to say, yeah. I mean, you might come up with an apologetic, deceptive sense of, I'll explain it away. But if you're being honest, you're going to be like, gosh darn it, that sounds like it's in some way, it either influenced it, or start with the worst, it just copied it, or it influenced it, or it's a response to it. Like they're trying to say, let me tell you a better version of it, and they're not copying it, they're giving you the opposite. What is Mimesis about, and what part does that have to play in mythicism?
Well, I hate to disappoint you, but
Okay.
I can't tell you a whole lot about Mimesis per se.
Okay.
I know that is, what's his, Dennis McDonald, I think.
Yep.
That's his area, especially. I've not gotten to any of his books just yet.
Okay.
Derek Lambert is a great person to talk to about that. And perhaps you could probably even get Dennis McDonald on your show. I specialize more in the area just of general religious syncretism, where this stuff may not have been consciously or directly borrowed or copied or plagiarized, but you can tell that it's stemming from the same kind of the term I use, mythic consciousness of the times. Not to say that it's like collective consciousness, but it's the same kind of thought world from that day and age, in terms of, if you were going to tell a story, this is how you were going to tell it. For instance, the appearances, whether you call them post-mortem or post-mortal, of Hercules. Hercules, after his death, and he appears to his mother Alcmene in his divine body in Hercules Otaeus, which is a play from the 1st century. He's like, mother, stop your weeping. I've been granted my place among the gods. Romulus, as I mentioned, appearing to Proculus Julius after he's been raised up to heaven. He didn't actually die per se, but he's been taken up and immortalized, and appears to Proculus and says, hey, I'm go and tell the Romans that that I am their new god Quirinus, and that the Roman might shall rule the world. It's giving a great commission, so to speak, or Asclepius appearing to others after his apotheosis and whatnot. You can tell that the gospel stories are the same kind of stuff, whether they were, were they actually consciously influenced by these other stories? Maybe. It's hard to say. But again, there's no doubt it's the same kind of stuff, generally speaking. And as that relates to apologetics, it's special pleading to say that in this case it happened, and in all the other cases, and that of course is where they come in and they say, oh no, but we have such strong evidence. No, you don't. I've seen your arguments. They're garbage, if I may speak plainly. But in some instances, you do really have to wonder, such as I know with Pythagoras, he guesses just how many fish will be caught in their nets, and sure enough, after they catch the fish, he was right. He possesses also the power to where all of these fish remain alive after they've been cast back into the sea. Now, the thing of it is, they never tell you in the story precisely how many fish were caught, what his guess was. But interestingly enough, the vestiges of this story remain in John's gospel, because they actually tell you it's the number 153, which doesn't have any significance at all in Christianity, but it does in Pythagoreanism. So this is where you kind of have to say, yeah, they must have been aware that they were knocking off Pythagoras here. And in a lot of cases, I guess you could say it's undoubtedly some kind of direct influence, because you have a lot of competitive assimilation going on to where they're trying to do. And then great David David Litwick, is great on this point in Iusis Deus, the depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean god. That's what he talks about, where they're basically, what they're doing is they're saying, hey, Jesus not only did what your God has done, but he did it even better. Your deity was born through the process of Zeus having impregnated a mortal woman. Well, in this case, the Holy Spirit simply overshadowed a virgin, and she became impregnated without any kind of contact or intercourse or otherwise. So, he did what yours did, only better. You do see that the kind of thing going on where it seems rather obvious. So, do I think that these stories probably were influential in some way? I think one of the great distinctions that are made in academic circles is between analogy and genealogy. So a similarity could be merely analogical, just meaning that there is a very distinct parallel there, even without them one having necessarily influenced the other. Right. Genealogy, or being a genealogical comparison, means that they are genetically linked, they're related, and there must have been some kind of direct influence. Right. Again, per the principle of analogy, that is to say that if something does not, if it's something that does not correlate to what we see in the real world, but it does correlate to ancient myth, whether or not one influenced the other, you've got to say it's an ancient myth. You just have to. You're being irrational if you don't. Yeah, exactly. So that's where I think this stuff is significant. Now, in terms of Jesus's historicity, I'm agnostic on the matter. I have argued before for mythicism, but then I have retracted whenever I've come across new arguments. And I've done this so many times, embarrassingly, that I've finally had to throw my hands up and just say, I don't know. I have no idea. I think, though, that if you're like Bart Ehrman and you come out and say, hey, look, this guy was historical, and if you say otherwise, you're an idiot. You don't know that, Bart. You're following an academic axiom wherein that is the that is the guiding principle in New Testament scholarship right now. Doesn't mean that it's a fact. I just don't think that we can say for sure. I think that there's good arguments from both camps. The thing that makes me wonder is, for instance, when Josephus talks about James, who was the brother of Christ, you know, is he talking about our Jesus and James, or is he talking about Jesus and James, the sons of Damius? It's a matter of interpretation. Who knows? But if he is, that would seem to corroborate Paul's saying that James was the brother of the Lord, which, as I know mythicists say, you know, he may not have meant that this was a flesh and blood brother, that he was a brother in that sense. He could have been a cultic brother. Right. It's just, again, it comes down to interpretation. But I could see where Josephus and Paul, you know, that they may be corroborating one another on this point. Right. You know, I know mythicists will come out and say no because X, Y, and Z. It's one of those things that I wonder if it does possibly have some merit. There's also one of the best arguments I've heard in favor of historicity comes from, of all people, Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens. He himself may have gotten this from someone else, but he talks about where you can see in the New Testament the Messiah was supposed to have hailed from Bethlehem, but they've got to rework it to where he hails from, you know, where he does hail, even though he's Jesus of Nazareth. They had to renege this whole thing to where there was some bogus census to get him to come from Bethlehem. That right there makes you wonder, okay, was there a historical Jesus who was originally from Nazareth, but per the Old Testament prophecies, they had to rework things to get him from Bethlehem? That would be a good indication of the criterion of embarrassment at work, to suggest that there might have been a historical guy. Others, of course, argued that Nazarene in that time may have only implied a certain sect of Christians. There were Nazarenes. But then I'm left wondering, well, does that mean that he was a Nazarene? And that would still be another point in favor of historicity, because you're dealing with someone who was a Nazarene. Yeah. Again, I know that, I guess what I'm saying is that I sympathize with the mythicist movement, but these are the kinds of things that maybe, you know, make me wonder if maybe still there was such a person, even if he's more or less lost to history, because, as we've discussed, even if there was such a person, his story has been so completely overlaid with myth and legend that he's lost to us. Yeah. You know, even if there was a historical Jesus, the figure we are presented with in the New Testament is mythical. Yeah, and certainly
from the contrast of whether or not he was either one compared to who he's believed to be by the Christians. Right. It's like, if your God is so inept that there is a decent chance that he didn't exist, and we can show that, you know, that there's a very good chance he may not have existed, but that even if he did exist, the evidence is very shady and it's speculative, and at best, like you said, we don't really know who he really was at the beginning, because he became something else through the legends and so forth, and even through other Greek epic tales and so forth, where they just added, you know, compared him to someone else and rewrote some other story.
You do have to bear in mind that you had other figures in history who were undoubtedly historical, but who had some of these same myths attached to them. So that they were historical people, but they were deified in ways that accorded with ancient myth. So you have to wonder, if was Jesus another one of these guys? Who knows? Right. And then again, he may be, you know, like Hercules and Osiris, mythical all the way down. Right. For the purposes of, like, for instance, if you're going to if you're going to debate this stuff with someone who is a Christian, as even Richard Carrier has said, this isn't really a great point to bring up, because to
Right.
them it's so far-fetched that, you know, you might as well be telling them that the earth is flat, even though there are some who will go for that. But let's hope most don't.
Yeah.
It's so outrageous to them that it's not a very good starting point. So I think for all practical purposes, I'm willing to simply grant them historical Jesus and say, hey, look, that's fine. There may have been such a guy, but even if there was, it's clear that that he was deified in accordance with the popular myths and legends of the time, so that the stories that are told about him are clearly not true. But again, for me, I'm not trying to dissuade any Christian from their faith. So, you know, if one, you know, if one should want to argue with me that I should believe as such, I will absolutely bring these kinds of points up. But again, I just share this stuff to, you know, to educate like-minded people. And, you know, if a Christian wants to talk to me about it, I'll be happy to do so. Otherwise, I'm willing to live and let live.
Well, I will admit, and this is not to get into at all a debate or even a big discussion, because I
that's okay.
Want to wrap up shortly anyway. But just maybe to do a teaser for another video, maybe down the line. I actually do take a more aggressive stance on it, and the reason I say it is this. You'd say, you know, live and let live. I believe what I believe. You believe, or I don't believe, you know, any of that stuff. You believe your tooth fairy, your Santa Claus. The problem is, almost every belief that I'm aware of, especially Christianity, it always wants to multiply. And where does it start? Where is its biggest multiplier? Get those kids. Yeah. Get those kids. Get them young. You know, instill in them that they're wretched. They deserve hell. The uniqueness of Christianity. And I've got 4 kids under age 6, so this is near and dear to my heart. I'll leave my comment about this, and I want to ask you a final question to wrap up. But however many people I would have did and would have put in the kingdom as a Christian, I want to take out 10 times more. I want people to escape. I do feel an obligation, partly because I feel really bad. I feel really bad that I was particularly active in teaching youth in a youth group, first just as a helper, and then eventually when a youth pastor moved on, I and another gentleman, we kind of co-led the youth group while they looked for a youth pastor, and that search took a long time. So I was in that interim sense, I was one of the temporary youth pastors teaching and preaching to kids, and I feel an obligation to kind of make some amends, if that makes sense. Sure. But even if I didn't have that background, I would say I can't stand that they're teaching kids this stuff, especially when it comes to the wretchedness issue, the shame culture. You know, you deserve to be ashamed of yourself. The purity culture, that purity culture is, I got to do a whole big series on that someday, but there's endless issues, and I could and will at some point list out all the reasons that this stuff is bad. But I've heard before people kind of say, I don't really care, I'm just curious. I think Dr. Bob has kind of said that a couple different ways, a couple different times, and I don't fault him or you at all for it. I do feel an obligation, though, to be more aggressive. I'm sure you've heard Richard Dawkins talk about his more aggressive, stance on this stuff. I'm more in line with him because I want this world to wrap up its time, and I know it won't happen in my lifetime for sure, but I want it to wrap up its time with this crazy religion that has dominated history and caused so much damage. And I know mythicism is not, in any way related to stuff that happened in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages and all that, all the horrible stuff, the Crusades, but totally different part of this story. But there's some bad stuff that happened strictly because somebody couldn't look at this at the beginning and say, this is just mythology, it's just a story. Somebody had to say, this is real, therefore I have the right to kill a whole bunch of people. I don't know, I'm getting off track, and I apologize. I don't want to sound
this is a fascinating discussion, and I think it's great that you and I do have these diverging points of view with regard to this, because that's what makes this stuff interesting, right?
It is.
So, I was just thinking, though, as you were talking about that, it reminds me of the debate or discussion with regard to Islam. It's, do we try to just eliminate it, or do we try to go in and reform it? For me, it's if more Christians could be like the Christians that are closest to me, those among my friends and family.
Meaning good Christians that are
Yeah,
loving.
if more of them were like that, then it would be fine. There wouldn't be a problem. But
Right.
unfortunately, you're right. There is as I've said myself, there's a whole stripe of Christian fundamentalism and those in the religious right that absolutely are doing harm.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. I'm fortunate, I think, in that most of the Christians whom I know directly are not like that, and I'm not at war with them.
Yeah.
But there is undoubtedly that extremist, and extremism, let's face it, it's bad in any form. I'm sure I could catch hell for this, but there are those among my camp who are extremists, and I don't see eye to eye with them either.
Yeah.
I think moderation and some sense of balance has been lost in all of the craziness that's going on right now, because you've got extremists on all sides, and that could be our downfall, really, is extremism in all its forms. But no, I think it's great that you and I have this different point of view. I think that's, as Robert Price himself says, why not let 100 flowers bloom? So, this is the kind of meat and potatoes for folks that'll really create a dialogue. I think it's great. I don't hate you for it.
Well, the thing I mentioned, I think it was to Derek the other day, the other Derek, Derek Lambert, was back when I was in Christianity. One of the common themes of a sermon was you give someone the context of your passage, you give them the sermon, and then you give them the kind of the takeaway, the application. And you never want to end it with, this is just dogma for dogma's sake. This is dogma because of, I want you to live your, God, I want you to live differently. I want to transform your mind and your life. And so it's like, what is the application? What's the takeaway? And I definitely struggle with the takeaway of I just like to study this stuff because it's interesting, because it's history. I mean, we all like history. I mean, everyone's, someone's into Civil War, someone's into this, a lot of history, and it is fascinating to just be a historian. But I'm definitely more on the side of, I want to do something with it. But anyway, I wanted to finish with a question that's been on my mind a lot. This stuff, like I said a half an hour ago, it's overwhelming if you're brand new to this subject. If you're like Pythagoras, that has nothing to do with the Bible. I'm like, yes, it does. Mystery cults, Dionysius, Osiris, all that stuff, that has nothing to do with the Bible. Yes, it does. Who in the world is Josephus, and why do I care? What is astrotheology? What is numerology? It's a lot. So if you're talking to someone who came to you and said, Derek, I've watched some of your videos and Myth Vision and blah, blah, blah. I've read some of your books, and I get it. I'm starting to get it. I believed in Christianity. I believed Jesus was God. God was the creator of the universe. I believed Christianity was unique. It had a unique message, the gospel, that was not like anything else. That Christ was not a copy. He was unique in the whole of human history. It was real. I believed, and my entirety of my life now and my future for eternity was placed on the power of the cross of Christ, the power to redeem me from sin, put me in a right relationship with God, and that my hope is someday I'll be with him in glory, someday I'll be like Christ. And now, it doesn't sound right anymore. Now they're like, I wouldn't have ever thought I'd say this, but something's changed. There's some cracks forming. And as I listen to you, I read your books, I don't even know where to start. And so you come up with this newbie, and I'm only a year past this, so I know enough to be dangerous, not enough to really be someone that could guide someone maybe like you or David Fitzgerald could. But where does someone who's a newbie to this that says, I absolutely agree, there's more to this than I ever thought, way more to this than I ever thought. but I don't know where to start, and I don't want to go into the deep end. Where would you advise someone to start? Like, what subjects or even people to listen to? Who do you think is a good starting point for someone that says, I'm overwhelmed, but I want to get educated?
That's a really good question. Precisely because I've been in this for so long that I take certain things for granted. I might tell someone to go read Robert M. Price or Mircea Eliade or whatever, not really appreciating how much they might be really getting in over their head by looking into this stuff. So, golly. And it's funny because, I have to think about it. Like I said, it's been about 15 years that I've been looking into this stuff. And
Which is awesome.
and of course, and I'm an autodidact, and that I've done it independently. I didn't have any formal training. I have a college degree, but it's in communications. It's not directly related to this stuff, although it did help to build that sort of humanities sort of liberal arts background, which was indeed helpful. When I think about where I started, it was I started kind of on the wrong track with the zeitgeist and Dan Brown type material, but that did eventually lead me to the right stuff. So looking back retrospectively, where would I tell someone to begin? Holy heck.
While you're thinking, can I tell you what helped me the most at that level, and see if you have agreement with it? Richard Carrier's videos were, I think it's Why the Gospels Are Myth, and something about the mythology in the Book of Acts. I forget the title of it. I'll find it and put it in a link in the description. But where he walks you through how Acts, like Luke and Acts, are basically like the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're just switching up and responding to it. And he points out, I believe, in those videos, that he's pulling, these writers are pulling stuff right from the Bacchae, right from I believe the Aeneid, or however you pronounce that word, Aeneid. And he shows you that, the parallels. He's like, there's no way this is not mythology. And especially that very first one I mentioned, Why the Gospels Are Myth. It was a good starting point for me. I do know, though, that I was coming from a standpoint where, number one, I was eager. I was like, I got to figure this out. So, I come from a background where I had a Bible college degree. I took, 2 years of Hebrew. I took a year of Greek. I took all kind, I was neck deep into theology in the background. So for me, almost anything didn't feel too far over my head. Although I will admit the gematria stuff is blowing my mind. Gematria is, I'm in the deep end on gematria.
I don't know anything about that.
Do you know what that word means, though? What I'm referring to?
Does that not involve like Hebrew numerical type stuff, or am I off?
Yes, and they assign values to different letters and words, but they end up making,
such as with the Roman Emperor Nero, whose name is sort of
666 thing.
Yeah, kind of spelled out in Revelation.
It's like that, but on steroids. That is like the lowest level of it. It gets way beyond that. But anyway, if you get into gematria, prepare. If you're at all like me, it's like going from algebra 1 into advanced college level calculus. It's like there's just no way. Yeah. But I'm definitely going to master it. But those are the ones I was thinking of, the Dr. Carrier ones. Have you thought of anything that you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, now that you mention it, I think Dr. Carrier probably is a good choice because he chooses to convey this stuff in sort of layman's terms. You could say that he's kind of a populist in that way. He doesn't use a lot of technical jargon or anything like that. So Richard Carrier, I think, is probably a great starting point. If you can handle it, if you're up for it, Robert M. Price is my go-to. He's my number one. He's my favorite.
Well, if we weren't talking about a person, would you suggest a subject too that you would tell someone to start with?
A subject?
Like some people are just like, it's just Acharya, you're into astrotheology on day one. Like what subject would you pick as a good starting point that will keep people grounded but get them moving?
Well, I approach this, with my fascination in comparative religion, and that's where it all started for me personally. So, honestly, either Carey or Price would be good to that end. But Earl Doherty's The Jesus Puzzle is also an excellent resource, and you can find that online. Yeah, you can buy one of his books, but his website also, he's got a whole flurry of related articles that
Yes.
are linked on the Jesus Puzzle website. So if you just Google the Jesus Puzzle, he does an excellent job covering this stuff, and it's all there online for free. Um, so that I think if you were just starting out and you wanted a cost efficient way of getting into this stuff, that's an excellent starting point, I'd say.
And just a final clarification, when you said comparative mythology or comparative religion, you're saying, for example, get familiar with Greek gods, get familiar with Egyptian gods, get familiar with maybe Sumerian gods, get familiar with the gods that came all the way up before Christ, and start there and start to see how they could have influenced, what came next. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, with some caveats, because not all of the gods of antiquity have any kind of
Sure.
relevance to Christianity, but certainly those from the Hellenistic period. And again, that would be not classical Greece, but the period following the conquests of Alexander the Great. Where it wasn't so much about the Olympian gods anymore, but about the gods and heroes or demigods that were popular during that time: Hercules, Romulus, Asclepius, and then of course you have older deities that were imported into the Greco-Roman world via Hellenism. So they relate once more, Osiris being one of them. Um, uh, um, Other figures that are worth noting: Zalmoxis among the Scythians seems to have taught some kind of belief in eternal life, and they may, it's not spelled out in Herodotus, but they may very well have believed that he had risen from the dead, because as Herodotus tells it, he just returns from his cave. But for the Getae, for the believers in him, he had returned after they had thought him dead. So the only way that he could have convinced them that they could live eternally as he did was if they in fact thought that he himself had returned from the dead. Dionysus among the Greeks, of course, he's popular during the Hellenistic age. In the Old Testament, certainly religion among the Canaanites, because as we well know, the Israelites were just an indigenous tribe of Canaanites.
Right.
Not only do we know this from archaeology, like you'll find in the Bible Unearthed, that's a great resource for understanding the Old Testament and ancient Israelite religion and how this stuff relates. But also we know anymore from genetics that these people were related.
Yeah.
So no wonder you still find the Canaanite El still being used as a name for God in the Hebrew Bible, and in passages that seem to be in some way influenced to the cult of Baal. Even in Hosea, the notion of death and resurrection, though symbolic there, appears to have been influenced by the Baal cult. So certainly familiarize yourself with ancient Canaanite religion, because that absolutely is relevant to the Old Testament and the New, since the New Testament flows from a lot of these ancient Hebrew and Israelite, and even Canaanite ideas.
Yeah.
There's just so much, like you say, it can be overwhelming, but choose a particular point of interest and start there. And for me, the pagan parallels and the comparative religion stuff as it relates to the Judeo-Christian religion has been a particular point of fascination that I think many others might enjoy.
You've seen that video from Bill Zuersher, Seeing Through
Oh
Christianity?
my gosh, that one is fantastic.
Yeah, I think I might put that down in a link to it. It's that one. I can't tell you how many times I've watched it in the last year.
Yeah.
Just not because I get something necessarily new out of it. It just feels like every time I'm like, that's just such a, their core concepts. And a lot of it's just exactly what you were just talking about, but it's seeing how they evolve. And like David Fitzgerald, this whole thing is evolution. This religion is just evolution, changing from one Canaanite tribe into another, adding this dynamic, adding that dynamic, especially the Egyptian stuff with the circumcision and the blood sacrifice, and it just keeps evolving. And I love when someone takes very complicated stuff and endless education and erudition and just says, let me just tell you a story. This is how it weaves together. And I'm like, wow, that I could have read 20 books and still been confused. You told me a story in 30 minutes and I get it. I see where this thing happened, how this thing happened.
He gives this whole broad overview, like you said, in just half an hour, where he covers all the basic ins and outs of it. I'm envious of that video. I mean, he does a fantastic job. That's another excellent resource for someone who's just starting to get their feet wet.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know I've taken a lot of your time, probably went longer than we expected to, but I really can't say enough good things about you and about, I love reading your posts, especially the Heresium ones. I love your sense of humor. You bring us a sense of this is serious studies, but there's, we got to laugh at this at some level. There's some pretty crazy things going on here. And it is funny, and although you do feel bad for the people that are stuck in it, but it is funny on some level, and humor brings a lot of it down to a level I think is very appropriate and necessary to get through it all without, if you don't laugh, you're going to cry. But I appreciate that. I appreciate your honesty with your Addictus book, and I certainly wish you great success with what you're doing with John Loftus and the others in that book. And I look forward to seeing, whether we have interviews, every now and again, or if it's a while before I talk to you. I love seeing people. I mean, to me, I'll put it this way: people like you or David Fitzgerald to someone like me, it's like I'm a kid in a candy shop. I'm like, I can't ask you enough questions. I've got so much I want to ask, and I appreciate you guys being willing to take the time, because you could easily just say, you know what, I escaped, screw it, I'm done with this. And you're like, I know your job, you said, is you're not trying to help people escape necessarily, but it does, maybe it's a passive byproduct, but you are helping people escape whether you know it or not, or need to or not. And I appreciate it, because it's stuff like that helped me to get back to reality. So thank you for what you do and for what you're continuing to do.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope we do this again.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and see you next time.
All right.
Thanks, Derek.